All right, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to Fossil Free Eugene's webinar on Eugene's proposed electrification ordinance, focusing on the legal and implementation side of the equation. My name is Aya Cockram. I use she, her pronouns. I am the coalition coordinator for Fossil Free Eugene and your moderator for this evening's panel. First, I want to thank our incredible lineup of speakers for being with us here tonight. Thank you. Also, thank you to our participants for your engagement with this important topic for our community. So first, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are broadcasting to you from stolen land, Kalapuya Ilhi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following the treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed from to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today's descendants are citizens of the Confederate Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. And of course, land acknowledgements are great, but actions are better. So we do try and make sure that justice is a huge component of our campaign and making sure that we're centering important voices like Indigenous ones in this movement. So here is our program for this evening. As you can see, we have a lot to cover in a little time. As I said before, I've launched a poll that has some basic questions. I would encourage everyone to participate. As I said, it's anonymous. We won't share it. It's just kind of to see who's in the room to help us. So every one of the participants, attendees are muted by default, and you will not be able to unmute unless you are given privileges during the question and answer session. At the bottom of your screen, you will see that there is a question answer, and then there's a chat. You can click on either one of those to open those up. And we're going to request that you please do not use the chat for questions. We may lose them if questions end up in there. So please use the Q&A for questions. We also ask that you keep your questions to the point so that we have time to hear as many people as possible, because as I said, time is a little tight this evening. So we also want this to be a safe, respectful, and open discussion, and we do recognize that there will be a diversity of viewpoints represented by our audience, and we welcome that. Questions will be fielded at the end of the panel, so although you may post in the Q&A throughout the webinar, we will only get to those at the end. You can also raise your hand, which you can do by clicking on, I believe it is the reactions button, and you can raise your hand, and I will see that pop up in your screen, and then I can unmute you and call on you. All right, so I have just a very few quick things to talk to you about for those who are not as familiar with a Fossil Free Eugene. So Fossil Free Eugene was born when the city's franchise agreement with Northwest Natural expired a little over 3 years ago. This provided our community with an opportunity to discuss the role of the gas utility in the city's greenhouse gas emission reductions. We aim to hold the city accountable to their climate goals and to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels for a livable and just future. To properly support the task of transitioning to renewable energy, Fossil Free Eugene has a platform that I have outlined here that is threefold. We are trying to curb the growth of fossil fuel use by helping push through an ordinance mandating that all new construction be electric starting in 2023, and this will be the focus of today's webinar. We are also trying to make sure that our electricity is renewable and clean, which is an easy task with EWEB's leadership. Finally, we are committed to ensuring that this transition is a just transition. The disproportionate harms that the climate crisis and pollution have had on frontline and historically marginalized communities must be left in the past with gas. If you are interested in learning more about Fossil Free Eugene and about the benefits and impacts of electrification from a climate justice, health, and economic standpoint, I encourage you to check out our previous webinar, which I will link in the chat in a few minutes. I would now like to introduce you to our panel of legal and policy experts who collectively represent an amazing wealth of knowledge and experience working on clean energy and decarbonizing our buildings and cities. I will introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. Amy Turner joined the Sabin Center in 2019 as a senior fellow for the city's Climate Law Initiative, where her work focuses on the laws and legal tools cities use to achieve their climate mitigation commitments. In addition to legal academic research on municipal carbon mitigation law and policy, Amy consults directly with city attorneys and sustainability professionals on legal questions relating to carbon mitigation in the buildings, transportation, waste, and energy sectors. Prior to her work with Sabin Center, Amy was the executive director and co-founder of the New York City Climate Action Alliance. She continues to serve on the organization's board of directors. Amy graduated from Middlebury College and from Harvard Law School. Thank you for being with us, Amy. We also have Nick Caleb, who serves as the staff attorney at Breach Collective, providing legal and strategic support to grassroots partners across the country. Before joining Breach, Nick served as a staff attorney to the Center for Sustainable Economy and environmental policy staffer for Portland City Commissioner Chloe, and I might butcher the last name, Udali. While with the city of Portland, Nick stewarded the framework for Portland's 100% renewable energy policy, one of the most ambitious and comprehensive in the United States. He also gained professional experience as the staff attorney for Neighbors for Clean Air and Climate Law Fellow at Our Children's Trust. Nick graduated with an LLM from Tilburg University in the Netherlands after receiving a JD from the University of Oregon Law School. Thanks for being here, Nick. Kara Saylor is a staff attorney with the Green Energy Institute at Lewis and Clark Law School. Kara spends much of her time working on issues arising at the Oregon Public Utility Commission, most recently representing environmental advocates and community-based organizations intervening in a gas utilities rate case to press issues related to risks associated with the expansion of the gas system. She is also supporting local governments investigating options to decarbonize their buildings. Kara is a graduate of Lewis and Clark Law School. And finally, we have Amy Ryder, the Director of Policy Acceleration for the Building Decarbonization Coalition, where she works to collect and disseminate best practices for eliminating building-related pollution. She has held positions with local government agencies, consulting firms for more than 20 years, working to optimize local climate action through knowledge sharing, behavior change, and technology implementation. She holds a bachelor's degree in energy management and design and a master's degree in water resource policy and planning. So as you can see, an amazing group of experts here. So I will go ahead and turn things over to Amy.
One second. Thanks so much, Aya, and thank you so much for having me. So hi, everyone. My name is Amy Turner. I'm a senior fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, and I focus on local government climate law and policy around the country, including building electrification and natural gas bans. I'm going to take a few minutes and talk through what we've seen in the local building electrification and or natural gas ban space, if you want to call it that, from the national perspective. And then my colleagues will sort of take that and drill it down to how it might play out in Oregon and, how it's played out to some extent in other states, so that you can, kind of understand how some of the policy options that have been used nationally might work in the Eugene specific context. So I'm sure over the last 2 to 3 years, when you're all on this call, I'm sure over the last 2 to 3 years, you've seen the headlines about cities, quote, banning gas from new buildings, starting with Berkeley in the summer of 2019 and Brookline, Massachusetts, a little later that year, along with dozens of other local governments in California and a handful in other states at this point. You'll see during the course of my remarks that I use the term natural gas ban in some instances and building electrification in others. These two concepts are really two sides of the same coin. So if you have a building that has no natural gas connection, it's not allowed to have natural gas piping up to the building, that building is going to have to run on electricity. And on the flip side, if you build a building that is all electric, you won't need that natural gas connection. So, there are a couple of different legal and policy mechanisms at play to make these things happen that make them a little bit different, but they're really two sides of the same coin. And so, you will hear me say natural gas ban. In some instances, it is more accurate than others, but I tend to use the terms somewhat interchangeably. So I always feel like it's worth kind of stepping back for a second to remind ourselves, why we want to phase out natural gas use in buildings. First, the climate reasons. Building emissions are really key to any community's climate action plan. Buildings account for about 40% of energy use and greenhouse gas emissions in the US. Some communities that percentage is far, far higher. And building electrification is one of the key ways in which we will decarbonize our building stock as a whole. We've got to make sure that buildings are as energy efficient as possible. We've got to switch sources to electricity, energy sources to electricity, and we've got to make sure that our electricity supply is powered by clean energy. All of these have to happen more or less in parallel. And, obviously federal government and the states are, really critical to greening the electricity supply. Local governments have a lot more authority over the efficiency and electrification components. And, new buildings are a great place to start. But there are also really important public health reasons for electrifying buildings. We're increasingly seeing research about the indoor and outdoor air pollution caused by natural gas appliances. Really gross stuff like particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, formaldehyde that can cause, really bad health outcomes. And this can be an equity issue as well, particularly as apartment buildings and other small homes are less likely to have adequate ventilation. I would be remiss if I didn't mention West Virginia versus EPA, the case that came down from the Supreme Court last week. The case, as many of you likely know, significantly restricted the EPA's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. And it also set up a new legal standard that might make it harder for federal agencies generally to regulate. What I think is really important, though, is that the case does not restrict local authority to act at all. The ruling may make it harder for local governments to achieve their climate and clean energy commitments, particularly if the federal government is not able to do its part to decarbonize the electricity supply. And that could certainly be a real setback. I don't mean to downplay that, but cities, including Eugene, can still hit really hard on climate, and now is a particularly good time to do so, given the failure at the federal level. So, we're going to talk through the legal pathways that have been used by local governments in the US so far to regulate gas use in new buildings. This is a term I use a lot, legal pathway. What I mean by it is a law or set of laws and legal tools that can be used to advance an identified policy goal. The policy goal, of course, here is either building electrification or, prohibiting natural gas connections to new buildings. So these are the legal pathways that I will discuss. I want to note that many of these policies that we'll talk through have exceptions, they have varying timelines, there's a fair amount of community-specific nuance. Amy Ryder can probably speak to some of it if there are questions. Some policies exempt cooking, some exempt commercial kitchens, hospitals, lab space. Some of them exempt backup generation, some apply to residential or commercial, or one of them phases in sooner over time. So there's a lot of nuance, and we're kind of going to gloss over all of that and just really look at the City of Eugene's authority to implement one of these policies at all. And then if you go on to implement one of them, you can dive into the weeds a bit more on this. So first up is the direct prohibition on gas line extensions to new buildings. This legal pathway is really the closest thing to a quote natural gas ban, even though we use that term sometimes more broadly than we should. So in this particular legal pathway, local governments are relying on their police powers, which can be defined as their general authority to regulate with respect to resident health, safety, and welfare to justify these prohibitions. And they've generally attempted not to regulate anything within the building itself. It's just that gas line extension. Berkeley, California was, of course, the first municipality to ban gas at a community-wide scale back in the summer of 2019. Got a lot of headlines for doing so. And with a handful of exceptions or opportunities for variances, Berkeley has prohibited gas line extensions to new buildings. It relied on its police power in doing so, and this ban is in effect. You can see here, I pulled this from the law's legislative findings. You can see that Berkeley really relied on its health and safety authority, its ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. It talks about the impacts of climate change on the city of Berkeley, being a coastal city, being vulnerable to sea level rise, being vulnerable to wildfire risk and earthquake risk, which can be particularly dangerous for natural gas facilities. Talks about local air impacts, health impacts from poor local air quality, really is relying heavily on the health and safety impacts of natural gas in justifying its ban. I do want to note that Berkeley is facing some litigation with respect to its natural gas ban. A restaurant industry group called the California Restaurant Association brought suit against the city, alleging that Berkeley's prohibition was preempted by federal law. The US District Court ruled in favor of Berkeley, upholding the ban, but the Restaurant Association has appealed. So the case is currently before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the highest level appeals court in the US, below the Supreme Court. For the moment, we have a court ruling from the federal district court saying that the Berkeley gas ban approach is totally fine from a federal law perspective, but we're certainly keeping an eye on that Ninth Circuit case. I also want to note that Brookline, Massachusetts, which is a very small town outside of Boston, also followed this direct prohibition legal pathway, and they ran into some legal hurdles with it. It was struck down by that state's attorney general as preempted by 3 state laws, including the statewide building code. I hate to end this legal pathway on such a downer. I want to note that Brookline's legal hurdles were very specific to Massachusetts law. It really says nothing about how this kind of ban would fare in other states. I'd love to see other local governments, including Oregon, take up this approach. And you'll hear from some of my Oregon colleagues about how this might work. So the second legal pathway is the all-electric building code or construction code, which requires or strongly incentivizes that new buildings, or in some cases substantially renovated buildings, be built to an all-electric standard. This is far and away the most common approach by number of local governments. Dozens of them in California at this point have passed this sort of all-electric construction code. It is admittedly much easier to do for local governments in California than it is in Oregon. We can certainly talk through some of the implications of that. I don't think that our remarks will focus too strongly on this particular legal pathway. But folks on the call have done some work in this space, particularly Kara, if there are questions about the building code legal pathway. The third legal pathway is the use of air pollution control authority that some local governments have. I mentioned in the first couple of slides, gas appliances emit a great deal of local air pollution, NOx, particulate matter, formaldehyde, other really yucky stuff. Particularly when they're not well ventilated. And of course, they emit a lot of carbon pollution and methane pollution as well, which is a particularly potent greenhouse gas. And some local governments have a good amount of authority to regulate air pollution, including in the state of Oregon. So this is a local pathway that I'd like to see get far greater use than it has. There's a huge amount of potential here. To reduce local air pollution and greenhouse gas pollution by phasing out these gas burning appliances. So far, the only building electrification or fossil gas phase out effort I've seen use the air emissions legal pathway is in New York City, where the city is amending its building code to limit the amount of greenhouse gas pollution per measure of energy that a new building can emit. Again, another approach I'd love to see adapted in Oregon. It would have to work a little bit differently than it does in New York City, because New York City has sort of an easier access to its building code authority. I think a more direct approach in Oregon would be to codify air pollution requirements in an environmental or health or safety focused part of the local code. The fourth legal pathway is for a local government to use its zoning authority to incentivize gas-free construction. An incentive could come in a whole variety of forms, a density or size bonus, a break on another requirement, expedited permitting, reduced permitting fees. This is really the same as a local government offering a density bonus for LEED compliant building, for example. It's pretty straightforward. I'd like to see this legal pathway also get some more use than it has. The last legal pathway that I'll highlight Just really to mention quickly is that local governments have a great deal of authority to phase fossil fuels out of their own buildings. This is certainly something that's starting to play out in Oregon. I think we could see a lot more of it, but something to keep in mind. So that's it from me. That's what we've seen nationally. I want to reiterate that these policies, are all for phasing out gas from new buildings, not existing buildings. And I'm going to pass the mic over to my Oregon colleagues. I think Nick is next, who can speak to you about how these legal pathways might work in the Oregon and Eugene specific context. Thanks, everyone.
So I'm a climate energy attorney at Breach Collective. Breach Collective is a nonprofit, relatively new, about almost 2 years old now, based in Eugene with folks all over the place. Our mission is to partner with communities on the front line of the climate crisis and to advance justice through locally driven campaigns rooted in the power of grassroots organizing, advocacy, and human stories. We're also unionized through the Communication Workers of America. So I and a lot of folks on this panel have been taking a close look at legal authority to intervene in big questions of climate resiliency and electrification and basically just the energy transition broadly for a couple of years now, and have learned quite a bit. And as Amy Turner is describing, there's a big movement around the rest of the United States in local governments to start moving forward with local regulation that's advancing a vision of renewable electricity and phasing out of gas. And so we wanted to look and see how much authority there is in Oregon to do the same thing. And the quick and dirty answer is that we think there's quite a bit of authority in Oregon. I think there are viable and legally defensible regulatory pathways available for local governments. Probably a little bit to the chagrin of the fossil fuel industry, there's a lot of ability for local governments to intervene here. There are, of course, technical barriers to getting involved in energy system questions, but I'd say that's a conversation that's a little bit outside of what our focus will be tonight. In terms of the direct question about legal authority, there's a lot of pathways available, at least a half dozen. We're going to be focused mostly tonight on a draft ordinance that Carol will be talking about. So I'm not going to broadly go into a bunch of different theories of how local government might intervene in this, but I will give a little bit of an overview as to how that law works in Oregon. So we are, Oregon is a home rule state. So it was one of the, I think it was the first home rule state in the United States. And the theory of home rule is that local governments should be entitled to a lot of autonomy in how they govern themselves. And, originally this authority was much broader than it is now. It's been whittled down by courts and legislatures over time, but there's still a lot of authority for local governments to, one, regulate for so-called police powers, which means, or they have the so-called police powers, which means that they're able to regulate for the protection of public health, safety, morals, and welfare. And this is a pretty broad authority. They're also able to license and to tax. So this is a very broad power that's available to most forms of government and is higher in Oregon than it would be without this home rule authority. That power can be limited by state legislatures or Congress. And in Oregon, at least, our standard for how the courts make sense of this is that there's two categories of what's called preemption that the state legislature might engage in. And preemption, for a lay person means that the legislature would be taking authority away from a local government, saying they can't do something. And there are two kinds of preemption. One is express preemption, where the legislature states clearly that a local government is not allowed to do something. And then there's implied preemption, where there's laws or programs that are written in such a way that it would be infeasible or extremely awkward for local government to have authority. But in Oregon, the courts generally start their analysis by assuming that local laws are consistent with state laws. And that means that the burden is generally on someone challenging those laws to show how a law would be out of line with state law. So kind of back to the question of police powers, if there is this sort of broad police power that's available to local governments, I argue that it is broad, and have worked in the areas of attempting to regulate the fossil fuel industry at local government. To the surprise of, I think, a lot of folks over the last 6 or 7 years, we figured out a lot of ways for local governments to intervene and restrict harms from fossil fuel developments. But the analysis really of exercising that police power starts with, is there harm, and can you demonstrate the harm? And when you think about natural, quote, natural or methane gas, and this kind of industrial complex of extraction, transport, storage, and combustion, and the delivery of that gas to homes and businesses, there are quite a few harms that are on display. And we touched on these a little bit, but there's air toxic exposure, both in the home and outside the home. And this is something that a lot more information is coming out about all the time. A lot of information has been made available in national media over the last years to draw more and more attention to this. Just recently, the American Medical Association passed a resolution highlighting the harms of indoor, or the risks of air toxic exposure from gas combustion, and is going to start, trying to advise people how to deal with that. And it's also something that we're learning, at least in some of the air toxics that are caused by gas consumption in nitrous oxides, are not actually easily vented away. It turns out that particular gas it's very hard to vent away. So those harms are even probably more severe and less likely to be mitigated than we currently understand. And we're learning more about that. So that's a harm that can be demonstrated. People are learning more about that. Within the system of storage and delivery, there are leaks that are far more common than you might expect. And there's some data to suggest that Northwest Natural system is in the bottom half of the United States in terms of leakage in their system. There are explosions that are possible. And there was one in Northwest Portland years back that I think near 23rd Street. So in my city, I've seen that happen. And then we live in a seismic region. And as you can imagine, gas, a combustible gas moving through pipes is generally seismically vulnerable well. So those are risks that you can call upon. Then there are climate risks in the form of greenhouse gas emissions, and there's always new science coming out around that. And then another risk is increasing cost to ratepayers. It seems the cost of gas will continue to rise over time. And most of these are risks that, in the case of Eugene, you could demonstrate as affecting Eugene residents. And if so, strongly arguable that there are ways that local governments could try to mitigate those harms and risks to their population and utilize those police powers. I just want to draw folks' attention before I pass it to Kara to a report that was published last year, Methane Gas, Health and Safety and Decarbonization. There's going to be a new version of this, an updated version with some of the newer science that's coming out that's even clearer on these points than what we knew in the past. But I would if you're on your computer, which you almost certainly are if you're on Zoom, just kind of Googling this and taking a look will give you a good understanding of all of the harms and risks that I talked about, and as well as a lot of the campaigns that gas utilities are using to try to avoid talking about these and to push back regulation for as long as possible. So I'm going to stop there and pass to Kara so she can talk more about the specific ordinance that we want to talk to you about tonight. And then later, when there are time for questions, I'm happy to go into detail about anything that I may have overlooked in that short presentation.
Thanks, Nick. That was very efficient. All right, are we good?
Yeah, looks great.
Thanks so much. So thanks again, and thanks for the audience members for being here on a relatively late evening webinar. It's really nice to have everybody here. So I'm a staff attorney at the Green Energy Institute. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, GEI is a climate and energy policy institute located within Lewis and Clark Law School's Environmental, Natural Resources, and Energy Law program. And we aim to hasten the energy transition by strengthening existing policies, eliminating barriers, and promoting innovative and ambitious new strategies to prevent catastrophic climate change. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited to be here talking about this today. So as you heard from Amy Turner, the most common method used by local governments around the nation is to use building codes to regulate gas. But any local law, as you heard from Nick, seeking to promote building electrification like Eugene's will need to avoid regulating in an area that's already controlled by state or federal law. And so when we're talking about building codes, it's important to know that Oregon law expressly preempts local governments from adopting ordinances that impose different requirements than the state building codes do. And you can see that language on the slide here. The Building Codes Division is the entity that's responsible for adopting the building codes. And we have to be really careful in regulating in this area, not to adopt something different from what the state building codes do. So keeping that building code preemption in mind, in an attempt to assist the process in Eugene, GEI and a few other partner organizations represented here today on this call put together a concept ordinance. We followed the directions set out by staff in the April 13th, 2022 work session summary, with some suggested tweaks to improve the ordinance based on outcomes in other cities. But, as you heard from Amy Turner, there are a lot of different pathways that are possible in suggesting this concept ordinance. We're not saying this is the best or the only. We're just working within the process that's already been sort of on the move in Eugene and trying to help that process along. So in that April staff report, the staff described City Council's direction as requesting a discussion about changes to city code that would require all newly constructed residential, commercial, and industrial buildings to be electric only beginning January 1st, 2023. And then the staff report also reflected that they'd had conversations with the Eugene City Attorney's Office and the Oregon Building Codes Division, and that based on those discussions, staff indicated it believed that City Council could prohibit new natural gas in new construction by adopting an ordinance that just simply amends the city code and adds a new section to Chapter 6. That's the Environment and Health section of the Eugene City Code. And so according to that report, staff suggested the code amendment could simply state that natural gas infrastructure is prohibited in newly constructed buildings. And the amendment would add definitions for natural gas infrastructure and newly constructed buildings in Chapter 6's definitions section. So we took the kind of the direction from that staff report and put together a model ordinance that we hope could be useful to City Council. And again, adding just a few tweaks to sort of fill out the ordinance in a way that Amy Ryder can discuss in more detail. But essentially what we've done is simple. We're suggesting adding 4 provisions to Section 6 of the Eugene Code. The first section does exactly what staff indicated they are thinking they do, which is prohibit natural gas infrastructure in newly constructed buildings. And then the ordinance goes on to describe its applicability. So it directs that the ordinance will take effect on January 1st, 2023, and apply to all newly constructed buildings. So that's residential, commercial, and industrial zone buildings. But it's important to note that the language can be modified to delay application of the ordinance to commercial and industrial construction, for example, setting a January 1st, 2024 date. And that would just allow additional time for businesses to incorporate the new rule into their planning. Again, we're not suggesting that that's a good idea. We prefer an earlier implementation date, but recognize that there are sometimes conversations that are happening that may make this more complicated, and there's leeway in the ordinance to do that. The section also explains that The ordinance doesn't apply to portable propane appliances or fuel backup electric generators, and that it does not require the installation of specific appliances in buildings. The third section defines those key terms. So it explains that a newly constructed building is one that is a building that has never before been used or occupied for any purpose. We suggest applying the ordinance to building additions, and the ordinance suggests using square footage as the criteria for determining whether an addition would qualify for regulation. We want to avoid any loopholes. And then other terms are defined, including physical infeasibility. And so that is that final section of the ordinance, which provides for an administrative process in which infeasibility waivers may be granted by the city. And that physical infeasibility is defined to mean technological or other non-cost factors which make the project unsuitable for its intended purpose. This infeasibility waiver language is closely based on a waiver that was adopted by Petaluma, California. Also the ordinance as currently written requires that any building granted an infeasibility waiver be constructed as electric ready. And electric ready is defined, it's a defined term, and it just means a building that contains electrical systems and designs that provide capacity for a future retrofit of a building to an all electric building. It also states that the infeasibility waiver would not apply to the entire building, but rather limited to the application that the city has found to be physically infeasible without the use of gas. So it's very narrowly drawn. And again, Amy Ryder, who will speak next, can talk a little bit more about this, but this is based on the emerging practice from California jurisdictions, which use this model language. And so I'll pass it on to Amy to take it from here.
All right. Well, thank you so much to my fellow presenters and to all of those in attendance this evening. As was implied, I have been invited here just to talk about some of the specific trends that we're seeing across the country and the specific language applicability based on those best practices for Eugene. Again, I'm Amy Ryder with the Building Decarbonization Coalition, and I will walk you through here briefly, but just in case you haven't heard of Building Decarbonization Coalition and our catchy name, we are a membership-based organization that works nationally, representing a number of different types of entities. We work with manufacturers and utilities and environmental groups and local governments, among many other groups, to decarbonize buildings, as the name implies. So just to give you a snapshot here, since 2019, although that was the earliest of the gas moratoriums, there's a few that predate 2019, but there are in total 80 different jurisdictions in the country who have adopted some sort of either requirement or encouragement in policy terms, so not just incentives, but policy that encourages or requires the electrification of buildings, both new construction and existing buildings. And you can see that that includes 3 different states here that have taken action at a statewide level to make those changes. As was mentioned by, I believe, Amy Turner, many of those are under the energy code in the various jurisdictions, but certainly that is not limited to that scope. But we're seeing this trend just continue to spread more and more, and the variations are many. There are 58 jurisdictions in California alone, very few of which are the same, that have adopted some sort of local ordinance. But what's emerging from that is a lot of lessons that we can then extrapolate and watch over the course of time how well they're working. And so that's what we've been doing at the BDC, is tracking those trends. So just to share some of those with this audience for this evening and how they might apply for the purposes of Eugene is back in 2018, 2018, there was a similar legal assessment done for a few states that were looking at doing this early on in local government world. And in 2019 is when the adoptions really started in California, and 2020 in Massachusetts. So they've been picking up steam over time. But what we're seeing is that many of those jurisdictions started with encouraging. So effectively having a code that would say, we'd like you to build electric, but if you still want to include natural gas in your system, you have to go a little bit further in terms of your overall efficiency. That was one approach that was more common in those early couple of adoptions. Most of the jurisdictions were adopting new construction codes only, and a few of them were having broad exceptions for building types, especially in laboratories and research and development facilities, among others. And then there were a few cities who opted to actually not include specific appliances because there were concerns for a number of reasons from their residents, saying that these appliances might be harder to come by, more expensive, or perhaps be specific to a constituency that was more sensitive. Especially, for example, the commercial cooking equipment, as you might imagine, in 2020 and 2021, having additional requirements at restaurants was certainly politically not the best thing, and certainly not what any of us wanted to see it during that time. However, since that occurred, we're in the last couple of years, 2021 and 2022 in particular, we're really starting to see new trends emerge. And frankly, even some of the jurisdictions that adopted early have come back. I think 5 of them now have come back and adopted more stringent ordinances. So most of which are now requiring full electrification for almost all building types, universally new construction, but we're also expanding into remodeling. The definitions, however, as was mentioned, while generally based on square footage, they do vary. Some are based on the total cost of the project. And then where appliances were being called out as perhaps areas of exemption previously, generally the movement has gone towards these waivers, as was discussed earlier. And there's different types of waivers that we've seen, but most of them, and the best practice today, seems to be of the technical or physical infeasibility variety. We've also seen phase-in dates. For example, the city and county of San Francisco reached a negotiation point with their local restaurants to have a 6-month grace period before it became a requirement to electrify commercial cooking in San Francisco. That date has since passed almost a year ago now, with no known issues from the staff there, but they just allowed that extra time in wake of COVID. And so just a quick note on infeasibility waivers before we open it up for questions. And so technical limitations and physical limitations, what does that really mean? Typically what we see is that we have site-specific technologies that might just not be foreseeable. That the most common of which that comes to mind is, I own a wood-fired pizza kitchen. What can I do that is electrifying my wood fire? Wood fire's in the name, the fuel source. While there are great electric technologies for making pizza, as Amy Turner and I have long discussed for applicability in New York, there are potential areas where we just can't necessarily foresee what that technology might be that someone wants to use. So the technical limitations might apply in cases like that. We also see that in energy modeling or design system modeling systems, there are sometimes limitations just because the technology is evolving quickly, and design standards, when you're putting together a whole system, may not take into consideration all of that new technology that's available. And then we have physical limitations, which most commonly in urban environments are grid constraints. or rural environments where it's the end of a line and there's just not additional capacity to get extra electricity to the end of the line. And typically those can be corrected through additional generation, whether solar or wind or otherwise, at the end of the line. But that is a potential physical limitation, as are transformer locations in a really built out urban environment, potentially challenging. And then just a brief note on some of the advantages and considerations for these waivers. One of the things I personally like best is that technology is changing so fast, and codes, ordinances, et cetera, just don't move as quickly by design. So allowing that a waiver can give some flexibility to staff to allow for technologies that you might not know about or might be changing. But it also says it gives you some flexibility of not trying to forecast what new project might come into your city in the first place. So it takes the guessing game away. So there are considerations about whose job it is to fill out a waiver, whether that burden goes to the design team or the staff. But the staff would be reviewing these in the proposed language, although who that is could vary. And then, of course, whatever kinds of decision-making or appeals process needs to be carefully considered as to whose job that should be within the city of Eugene. So that's it for me. I get to send it back to Aya. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. That was so much valuable information when looking at the road ahead for us as we start to really look at the nuts and bolts of this proposed ordinance. And I know we have a city councilor, Matt Keating, in the audience, and Lucy Vennis in the audience. So thank you both so much for coming. So really, really helpful information for the public, for public officials, and for local businesses. I would love to open the floor up to questions. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A, or if you would like to just be unmuted, you can raise your hand. And I actually see it's just a button. I was in the bottom panel of your screen if you're on a computer. So please give us your questions, and let's start off with a question from Craig Peterson. One moment, please. Do you have any research that compares and contrasts natural gas versus coal when it comes to pollution energy diversity, and which is the worst source of electricity? Anyone want to take that one?
I don't have any concrete numbers, but I can take a stab at it for sure. So it depends on which kind of pollution you're tracking. Coal is dirtier from a particulate matter perspective, so leads to air pollution and health hazards and smog, versus natural gas, which is 93% methane. So therefore, a really substantial greenhouse gas pollutant. They both have their problems. It kind of depends on which metric matters to you. I would argue that we want neither of them.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. Does anyone have anything else to add before we move to the next? Great. So a question: what considerations have been given to the Western interconnection grid's ability to remain affordable and reliable? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I could try. Feel free to jump in, but I guess I'm surrounded by lawyers, which is fantastic, and I'm the energy nerd. So forgive me if I'm not an expert on regional interconnection by any stretch of imagination. But what I can say is that the grid expansion and conversion to electricity more as a fuel type is happening regardless of what happens with our buildings. And the capacity issues that are continuing to trouble us around reliability are largely charged and supercharged by climate change. So by limiting greenhouse gas emissions that perpetuate those problems. We actually can help to improve reliability over time. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be focusing on grid expansion and more electricity at large, because our demands continue to increase. But most of the technologies we're talking about have such enormous efficiency gains simultaneously that they are universally beneficial from that perspective as well.
Yeah, I think I'm not from the West Coast. I can't speak specifically to the question, but I think it does raise a really good point that it's extremely important when you're thinking about policies to phase natural gas use out of buildings, to convert buildings to electric, to really consider the cost impacts, in particular the energy bills of residents who may already be energy burdened and be paying a lot for their energy. It's a complicated question, depends very much on area of the country, what your energy market looks like, but you do want to do the inquiry into whether folks are going to see their energy bills spike if they are, if they have to use electricity. On the other hand, there are real cost concerns with leaving folks on the old gas system too, right? So, this transition to electric buildings is happening anyway. We want it to happen faster, but it's happening anyway. And so, what's going to happen if we don't sort of, help it along is that wealthier folks are going to transition to electric, leaving, folks who are already perhaps energy burdened, lower income on the old gas system, and they'll have to really shoulder the costs of this aging system among a much smaller customer base. So it's a really good question to raise because there are a lot of complicated issues. I don't think this is, I think there are really important cost considerations on both sides of the issue. I haven't seen anyone say we can't do this because of cost concerns, but you do want to think about exactly how an electrification program is being rolled out for those reasons.
Just add that these issues have been sort of front and center in the general rate revision that I'm participating in. Northwest Natural is requesting a rate increase. And we have intervened and made these issues, an important question for the commission to take on, because we need to be thinking about what expansion of the gas system means for existing ratepayers and for those who are left on the system who can't afford to electrify. I mean, I would just focus us though on the fact that this ordinance is about new construction, not existing construction, right? So it's very narrow. But I will point you to, and I'll put in the chat, it's lengthy, but some of you may want to kind of poke through and look at some of the issues that we've raised in the rate case. We just submitted rebuttal testimony last week. And one of the documents that maybe some of you have seen is an RMI analysis that was put together for the city of Eugene, which does discuss the cost benefit of electrification along with the emissions benefit. So you may be interested in poking around and checking that out. It's been docketed in the system on the Public Utility Commission's docket. So it is public, and you might be interested to look at it.
Awesome. Thank you. I will see if I can find a link for that and post it in the chat before we run out of time here. But we do have three more questions from three more folks. So let's see if we can get through these in the last 5 minutes we have here. So this is maybe another question for Amy Ryder, but we'll see. Has consideration been given to activists attempting to remove hydro dams, which is what presently provides Eugene's clean energy mix? What happens if the dams go away?
I'm probably not the best person to answer this question, as I don't live in Oregon, but this is not an unusual question in other parts of the country either, as we're trying to make general improvements to our grid. I don't know if that's been considered or what the planning process is, but I would assume that the state is very much looking at that while simultaneously moving towards 100% clean electricity also. I don't know if others have a better answer.
So, I mean, the general understanding is that, moving to electric buildings and electric appliances is more efficient, even in areas of the grid that are powered by fossil fuels. Obviously it is better if the grid is has a higher concentration, or is as close to 100% clean or renewable as possible, no doubt about it. But electrification in and of itself is still a good move, regardless of the composition of the grid.
Great. Yeah, that is, I think, just a generally challenging question. But I really appreciate the discussion on it. All right, I want to move on to a question from Jan Fillinger. What is the status of Eugene's adoption of a fossil-free ordinance? So that's part one. And the part two is, how soon can we expect passage of such an ordinance in the COE?
I think if the fossil free ordinance is referring to electrification of buildings, then what the next meeting is, working group is on July 11th, I think. And so I think that conversation is we're having it in real time, and the council is probably going to continue to be responsive to residents who are asking questions about timelines and when that kind of stuff might happen. I said July 25th is the working session. But yeah, I think the original intent, as I understand it, was to try to get an ordinance by this year that started applying in 2023. And I haven't read anywhere that suggests that that timeline is not going to be met anymore.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, and I think that the timeline that we're kind of looking at, and we'll see how things play out. But yes, there is an electrification work session on July 25th, and then we're hoping that the ordinance will be drafted, and then that ordinance will be voted on early fall. So then we'll kind of know early fall, ideally, what will be happening, whether we'll be able to move forward with that 2023 deadline or not, or start date. Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Nick. Last question, I do think we have time to squeak it in. Is there a plan in Eugene for a rooftop community solar in the electrification plan? Is EWEB in the conversation with the city to make net solar metering policy more incentivized to the public? I'm not sure if anybody can tackle that question, because a lot of folks are based outside of, well, everyone is based outside of Eugene. But I do know that working on clean energy for Fossil Free Eugene is something that is kind of in the next phase. We really want to make sure that we stop the expansion of fossil fuels as soon as possible. So once that expansion is stopped, then we can work on really cleaning up the grid. And I do think that EWEB has plans to create public incentives, and we can find out more and share out information about what those plans are. Thank you, Jim. All righty. So we are almost out of time here. So I just wanted to do a very quick call to action for everybody. Oops. So thank you all so much for coming. I know some people who came were supporters, some people were on the fence, and some people were not in support of the electrification ordinance. I hope you all found it informative. If anyone is interested in getting involved with Fossil Free Eugene, we did want to plug a couple ways you can get involved. The big one is to testify. City Council, it wants to hear from you, wants to know what the public wants. So the next City Council meeting will be July 11th at 7:30 p.m. If you are interested in finding out more information about getting our testimony guide, please contact me. I will throw my email in the chat. You have 2.5 minutes to testify, which is about 300 to 400 words typed. And you can always email in testimony if you aren't able to make it to the meeting. Other ways you can support the campaign, there's a whole slew of them. We have yard signs that you can request. They're delivered for free. You can complete an action email on our website. pass a resolution at the neighborhood level to support the platform. Oops. Follow us on social media, join our mailing list. My email is up here. I'll throw it in the chat, but please contact me if you're interested in other ways of getting involved. As we said earlier, very important to note the electrification work session will be July 25th. So make sure that you make your voices heard before then, because we're really hoping that the next phase will be drafting that ordinance so that we can move forward to a public forum and then a vote in early fall. So I wanted to just say thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate your time and engagement with this really important issue. And I think it was wonderful to have a robust discussion, to hear what your questions and concerns were, and to go through that with our panel. And of course, I want to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, to Amy Turner, Amy Ryder, to Nick Caleb, and Cara Saylor for being with us here tonight, for sharing your expertise, and of course for the amazing work that you're all doing across the country to make sure that we have a livable future and that we can decarbonize and move towards renewable clean energy.